welcome to another deep dive with us. This time, we're going to kind of flip the script on personal finance. We're always talking about spreadsheets and interest rates. But today, we're going way beyond the numbers. We're going to explore the psychology of money. And to help us with that, we're going to be diving into Morgan Housel's book, The Psychology of Money.
This is going to be interesting. It's crazy how much of personal finance is not about, the knowledge of money. It's actually about behavior. Housel says it very clearly. He thinks getting your mind right about money is just as important as knowing all about, how to pick stocks and investments and stuff.
Yeah, and, it's always kind of baffled me, like, you hear these stories of lottery winners ending up broke, just doesn't really make sense on the surface.
Yeah, and I think that's where House's kind of core premise comes in. He's basically saying financial success isn't really determined by how smart you are, like your IQ or how much you even know about money. It's really about how you behave and the decisions you make, how your experiences shape your outlook on money.
So it's like you could have a PhD in finance and still make terrible money choices.
Absolutely. And he tells this really fascinating story about a tech millionaire. The guy designs this key part for Wi-Fi routers in his 20s, like a genius. But he's out there flaunting cash, giving away thousands of dollars on whims, and just making impulsive decisions left and right.
This is reminding me of that saying, money doesn't change you, it just amplifies who you already are.
Exactly. And what might seem crazy to one person makes perfect sense to another, depending on, where they came from, their values, their background, their whole experience. That's why understanding your own kind of personal money psychology is so important.
Okay, I'm starting to see why this is way deeper than just picking the right stocks. Now, Housel also talks a lot about luck and risk. Things we don't always want to admit play a role in our lives.
Oh, for sure. And I think it's really easy to look at someone like Bill Gates, for example, and you just think, okay, this guy, he's a genius. And while he's definitely brilliant, Housel uses this story of Gates and his high school friend, Kent Evans, to kind of illustrate how much luck can really factor in.
Yeah. They both had access to a computer terminal in the late 60s, which is crazy to think about now. That access really helped to kind of launch Gates' whole career.
It did, but Evans died tragically in a climbing accident before he could realize his own potential. It makes you wonder, what if he had lived? Would he have achieved similar success?
I know, it's kind of a sobering thought, right?
Yeah.
It makes you realize that judging success solely on the outcome can be really misleading.
You got it. And I think that's the key takeaway here. When we underestimate luck, we tend to misjudge things. Our own successes, our own failures, and those of others.
So how do we factor in luck? Without kind of getting discouraged or feeling like we have no control?
That's a great question. And what Housel suggests is to really focus on the things that we can control. Our effort, the decisions we make, and our willingness to continue learning and adapting. And that brings us to, I think, one of the most crucial aspects of financial success. Compounding and time.
Yeah, that's huge. I always hear that saying time in the market beats timing the market. Is that kind of what he's getting at here?
Yeah. He makes a really fascinating comparison between Warren Buffett and Jim Simons, who's this incredibly successful hedge fund manager. Simons, he's actually achieved higher average returns than Buffett, but Buffett's wealth is exponentially greater. And that's because he's been investing for decades longer.
It's like the tortoise and the hare, right?
Exactly. It's not just about, hitting those home runs, those huge wins. It's about staying in the game long enough to really reap those benefits. Think of it this way. Most of Buffett's wealth, it wasn't built in his early years. It was actually accumulated later on thanks to the magic of compounding. So time is like this incredibly valuable asset.
See, now this makes me wonder, if you're just starting out, if you're investing, is it even worth it to invest small amounts?
Yeah. Even small amounts, consistently over time, they can grow to something significant. The key is really to start as early as you can and just let that compounding work its magic. It's like, planting a tiny seed. You might not see much at first, but with time and consistent nurturing, it can grow into this massive tree.
Wow, I like that. And all this talk about investing and stuff makes me feel like I should always be chasing those big returns. But Housel also talks about the value of saving money and being frugal, right?
Oh, absolutely. He argues that saving, it's not just about having this big pile of money. It's really about freedom and control. Control over your time, your options.
So I like the saying, money can't buy happiness, but it can buy freedom. Is that kind of what we're talking about?
Yeah. And think about it this way, the oil crisis of the 1970s. We overcame that, not by finding more oil, but by becoming way more efficient.
So we adapted to the situation.
Yeah. And the thing is, investment returns are always uncertain. You never know what's going to happen. But saving and being frugal, these are things that you can control, 100%. It's like building this safety net so you can weather those financial storms and jump on opportunities when they pop up.
It's like taking control of the things you can't control.
Yeah, got it.
This is making me rethink how I think about money. It's not just about making more. It's about having a better grip on what I've already got.
I love that.
Now, speaking of taking control, I always hear about these get-rich-quick schemes that pop up all the time, Does Housel ever talk about those?
Oh, he does. And he uses the story of Jesse Livermore, this legendary trader, as a cautionary tale. This guy, he made and lost fortunes multiple times. He was brilliant, but he was obsessed with getting rich quick, and he didn't really care about risk management. And that led to his downfall.
So he's kind of an example of the dangers of greed and overconfidence.
Yeah, exactly. Livermore's story is a reminder that real wealth, it's not built overnight. It takes time, it takes patience, and it takes this solid understanding of risk. The whole idea of getting rich quick, it can be very tempting, but it rarely leads to, any lasting success.
I always think back to the saying, slow and steady wins the race. I feel like a lot of financial wisdom is about resisting that impulse for immediate gratification.
I think that's a really good point. It's about thinking long-term, making those choices that align with your values and your long-term goals, not just jumping on the next, hot stock tip or something.
I have to admit, when the market gets really volatile, I get nervous. It's hard not to let your emotions get the best of you.
I totally get it. It's scary. But Housel has this really interesting way of looking at volatility. He says it's not really a fine, it's a fee. It's the price of admission for potentially higher returns.
Okay, tell me more about this volatility fee.
So think about it like buying a ticket to Disneyland.
Right.
You're paying a decent chunk of change, but you get this potentially magical experience, right?
So the ups and downs of the market, they're just part of the ride.
Yeah, pretty much. And Housel even points out that most attempts to time the market, they tend to backfire. They lead to missed opportunities, they increase your stress levels. What's the point?
It's like trying to guess which rides are going to have the shortest lines.
Yeah.
You just end up frustrated, right?
Totally. It's really about accepting that volatility is just part of investing and focusing on the long term, rather than trying to, outsmart the market every single step of the way.
This is actually giving me a whole new perspective on investing. It's less about predicting the future and more about getting a handle on my own emotions and behavior.
Yeah, and that's really what makes Housel's book so insightful. It's not about the technical stuff of picking stocks and bonds and all that. It's about understanding how we as humans think about money, which can be pretty irrational a lot of the time.
It's human nature, right? Speaking of irrational, we hear all these narratives in the news all the time, and they can really influence our decisions. Does Housel address that at all?
Oh, he does. And it's a really important point. He shows just how powerful, these narratives can be, especially those negative narratives, because they can drive market behavior. And this is even when the underlying economic fundamentals are strong. And he uses a really fascinating thought experiment to illustrate this.
Oh, I love a good thought experiment. What's it about?
So imagine an alien visiting Earth, right? Back in 2009, right after the whole financial crisis happened, he's flying over cities, he sees factories still humming, there's construction going on, people are going about their lives.
So it sounds like things are going pretty well on the surface.
Exactly. And the alien's like, okay, this economy, it's humming along, it seems pretty healthy. But then he checks out the news. Yeah. And he's bombarded with all these headlines, screaming about this financial crisis, massive unemployment, the stock market plunging.
He's probably thinking, what am I missing here?
Right. And it's such a great illustration of how narratives, especially when they're fueled by fear and uncertainty, can really cloud our judgment. They can even make us disconnect from reality.
So we're more influenced by, the stories we tell ourselves than the actual facts and figures.
Often, yeah. And I think that's the key takeaway. It's this reminder to be critical, to be skeptical, especially when these narratives seem overly pessimistic or based on speculation rather than hard evidence.
This is really making me think about how much of investing is not just crunching numbers, it's about our own psychology.
You've hit the nail on the head, and that's why I think, the psychology of money is so brilliant. It's about understanding these forces that shape our choices and learning to navigate them so we can benefit from them rather than, getting sabotaged by them.
This has been great so far. I'm already looking at my financial habits and, my beliefs about money in a whole new way. So where do we go from here?
We've only scratched the surface. In part 2, we're going to dive into even more insights from the psychology of money. We'll talk about, how to make those smarter financial decisions by understanding your own biases and learning how to actually control your spending habits.
Welcome back. It was wild, right? Sometimes we can sabotage our own financial goals, with our psychology.
It really is. Our brains, they're wired for that instant gratification, and that can make it tough to think long-term, especially with money.
It's funny you say that because, Housel actually uses the world of professional gambling to teach us some financial principles. Kind of counterintuitive, but I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, it's not what you'd expect, but there are these valuable lessons to be learned from, say, card counting and blackjack.
Card counting always seems so mysterious to me. Like, how does that connect to personal finance?
Well, it's not really about knowing, exactly which card is going to come up next. It's more about understanding probability, making those calculated bets, but also accepting that there's always a chance you could be wrong.
So even the best card counters, they can still lose.
Absolutely. And that's where this idea of room for error comes in. You see, successful card counters, they don't bet everything even when the odds are in their favor. They know a streak of bad luck could wipe them out if they're, overexposed.
So they're always kind of planning for things to go wrong.
Exactly. It's about building in that cushion, to protect yourself from those unexpected events. And it's a lot like the concept of margin of safety that Benjamin Graham, the father of value investing, always talked about.
Okay, so how can we apply this room for error thing to our own lives? I'm not planning on hitting the blackjack tables anytime soon.
That's the thing. It's relevant to pretty much every aspect of personal finance. It's just recognizing that things happen, right? Markets are unpredictable. We don't always make those perfect decisions.
Okay, so like having an emergency fund, that's room for error.
Exactly. Having cash on hand, if your car breaks down or something, means you don't have to sell investments at a loss or go into debt.
What about other areas? Where else can we build in that cushion?
Well, think about retirement planning, right? You might have this solid plan, but what if you get hit with a health issue or an unexpected job loss? Having that margin of safety, saving more than you think you'll need, being a little bit more conservative in your spending, it just gives you that flexibility to adapt, when life throws a curveball.
It's like those shock absorbers in your car for the bumps in the road.
Perfect analogy. And speaking of potential bumps in the road, Housel also warns against, using too much leverage, especially when it comes to investing.
Leverage is basically using borrowed money to, pump up your potential returns, right? Seems kind of risky.
It can be. While it can make those gains bigger, it also amplifies your losses. Housel says that leverage can turn even routine risks into disasters.
So it's like playing with fire.
In a way, yeah. It's tempting, especially when the market's doing well. You want to use leverage to boost those returns. But you got to understand the downside, right? What if things go south?
It reminds me of those stories, when the housing market crashed.
Yeah.
People buying houses they couldn't afford, thinking prices would just keep going up forever.
Exactly. Leverage, it can be seductive, but you got to use it cautiously. Really understand what's at stake.
This is all making me think about all the narratives we hear, especially in the media. There's always a new crisis, someone to be afraid of.
Housel, he dedicates a whole chapter to this, the power of narratives, how they shape our perception, even when they're not really based in reality.
It reminds me of this story about World War II. There's this German tank unit stationed outside of Stalingrad, right? But when they were needed on the front lines, a lot of their tanks, they were inoperable, couldn't move.
Oh, wow. What happened? I thought the German tanks were top of the line back then.
They were.
Yeah.
But the problem was, field mice had nested inside them, and they chewed through the insulation around the electrical systems. Mice took down tanks.
That's crazy. It sounds unbelievable, but it makes you think, right? We often plan for all these risks, but sometimes the biggest problems come from things we don't even consider.
So how do you protect yourself from those unknown unknowns? It seems impossible.
Housel suggests avoiding those single points of failure. He says, look, anything that can break eventually will break. So diversify.
Don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. Diversify your investments, your income streams, even your skills and knowledge, to make yourself more adaptable.
That makes me think about career planning. What if you spend years in one field and then it becomes obsolete?
It happens. And Housel tells a story about his friend, actually. Achieved his dream, became a doctor, but he's miserable.
It's so easy to chase after what we think we should be doing, only to realize later, things have changed. Our goals, our priorities, all of it.
Housel says we're actually pretty bad at predicting what our future selves will want. You change, your values evolve. What seemed awesome in your 20s might feel totally different in your 40s.
So what's the answer? Do we just give up on any long-term career planning?
No, not necessarily. It's more about recognizing those sunk costs,
Right.
those past efforts that you can't get back, and being willing to adapt, right, to make a change. Sometimes cutting your losses and moving on, that's the best financial decision you can make.
It's about being honest with ourselves. What really matters, and being brave enough to make changes, even if it means starting over.
I love that. Embracing change instead of clinging to those old goals, those outdated expectations, can actually lead to a more fulfilling and more financially secure life.
This is really making me rethink how I think about my career, too. It's not just about climbing that ladder. It's about finding that path that aligns with what I actually value and allows for growth and, change.
I like that. It's about creating a career that provides financial security, but also personal fulfillment.
We've covered so much in this deep dive. It seems like the psychology of money is about, shifting your mindset, not just learning new financial techniques.
Yeah, it's a great point. It's about understanding those sometimes subconscious beliefs and behaviors that shape how we handle money, and learning to make those choices that really align with our long-term goals, our values, everything.
So it's not just about being a better investor. It's about being a better person when it comes to money.
That's a great way to put it. And that's what I think makes this book so powerful. It's not just about money, it's about life.
It really is. It's about how our relationship with the money reflects, everything, our values, our fears, our aspirations.
And that's exactly what we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive. We'll get into Housel's insights on building a healthier, more fulfilling relationship with money. One that really supports your goals and allows you to live a richer, more meaningful life.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the psychology of money. I can't believe how much we've already learned about those kind of hidden forces that shape our financial lives,
It's amazing, right? We've talked about luck, risk, that kind of seductive power of leverage, and how those, powerful narratives we hear can lead us down the wrong path sometimes.
And, how avoiding those single points of failure, like having just one source of income, that can help us, when those unexpected things pop up.
For sure. But Housel doesn't stop there. He actually takes us on this journey through the history of the American consumer. And it's fascinating. It shows how past trends can actually give us valuable insights into the present.
I'm always up for a good history lesson, especially when money's involved. So where do we start?
He takes us back to 1945, the end of World War II. The country was at a crossroads, right? What were all these returning GIs going to do? Would they find jobs? Would the economy, take off or totally crash?
High stakes. So what happened?
The government, they took action. They kept those interest rates low to stimulate the economy, and they really encouraged people to spend, consumer spending. It was a huge shift from the whole wartime austerity thing.
So this was like the birth of the American consumer as we know it.
Exactly. I mean, there was all this pent-up demand for goods and services, after years of rationing. Plus, all the technological advances during the war led to, this surge in productivity, innovation.
Yeah, it sounds like a perfect storm in a good way.
Yeah, it was. And you know what? It worked. The economy boomed, wages went up, and the American dream, it seemed, within reach for a lot of people. But you know how it is. There was a hidden cost. All of this was built on a foundation of debt.
There's always a trade-off, isn't there?
It seems like a consumer credit became widely available, making it easier for people to buy things, houses, cars, all that. And this debt-fueled growth, it just went on for decades, and kind of shaped our economic system.
But didn't things change in the 70s? That's when we had that oil crisis and inflation went crazy, right?
Yeah, things started to shift. Inflation went through the roof, interest rates climbed, and that economic growth, it wasn't as smooth, And the gap between the rich and the poor, it started to widen. And honestly, it's a trend that's, kind of continued to this day.
It's like we're still dealing with a lot of the same issues, right? The inequality, wages not keeping up and
Right.
all that debt.
It's true. And Housel's point is that understanding, this history, it's crucial for figuring out today's economic world and making good financial decisions in the present.
Okay, so how do we use these lessons from the past in our own lives? Sometimes it feels overwhelming.
Well, one key takeaway, I think, is that economic cycles, they happen, right? These ups and downs, they're a natural part of how things work.
So like riding out those downturns is just part of the game.
Exactly. If you know they're temporary, it helps, to stay calm, not make rash decisions when things get scary.
That makes me think about, how we all react to the news. It's like they're always trying to scare us into doing something, making those quick choices.
I know. Housel reminds us to be skeptical of those narratives, the ones that are all about fear. Remember that alien visiting Earth, right? Back in 2009. Things were better than the headlines made it seem.
It's good to be reminded, to look past the hype and see the bigger picture.
For sure. And on the other side, don't get caught up when everyone's, super excited and optimistic. Those bubbles, they pop eventually.
So it's about taking that long-term view, knowing that markets go up and down, and not letting, those short-term things throw us off track, right?
Exactly. And you know what else is interesting? Housel talks about how our expectations are often shaped by, the economic world we grew up in, and that can create these blind spots.
That makes sense. Like someone who grew up during a recession might be way more careful with money, compared to someone who lived through years of, boom times.
Exactly. And that's why House says it's so important to keep learning, to be open to new ideas, to challenge our assumptions.
So basically stay curious and adapt as the world changes around us.
That's it. I mean, the world of money, it never sits still, right? So we got to move with it.
This whole deep dive has been amazing. I feel like we've learned so much about everything from, those biases we don't even realize we have to how history can teach us about money.
I agree. And we've got those practical things too, about managing risk, getting control of our spending.
But honestly, the most important thing for me is this. Financial success isn't just about the numbers. It's about understanding ourselves, our biases and how we think about money, our own personal relationship with it.
It really is. It's about making choices that feel right for us, choices that fit our values, our goals. Building a financial life that brings us security and, that feeling of, real satisfaction.
Like Housel says, it's a journey, not a destination, right? There's always something new to learn about money and, how it affects our lives.
I think that's a great way to put it. So as you continue on your own financial journey, remember all this stuff we talked about. Be aware of your own psychology, think long-term, and stay curious.
This has been a really eye-opening experience. I'm walking away with this whole new perspective on money, and a feeling that I can actually do this.
That's great to hear. Remember, you have the power to make those smart financial choices. Thanks for joining us.